Social media is abuzz today, at least in Alberta, over comments that Premier Danielle Smith made yesterday during a press conference about her 7-month moratorium on wind and solar projects. It's been very controversial. And I'm going to be talking to old newspaper guy, David Climenhaga, who is the blogger at Albertapolitics.ca. And he wrote a post called Premier and Feisty Reporters Spar Over Details of UCP Plan to Freeze New Renewable Electricity Generation Projects. So welcome to the interview, Dave.
Thank you very much. Hope you're well.
I am, and I hope you are as well.
I am.
Look, this is fascinating because, the Premier has a habit of making all sorts of off-the-cuff comments that get her into trouble, and she has to walk them back and so on. And it looks like when this was announced, there were a couple of letters one from the Alberta Utilities Commission, another one from the Alberta Electricity System Operator, that she claimed supported the moratorium. In fact, asked for the moratorium. And yesterday, reporters went after her, saying that no, in fact, those letters didn't say any such thing. What's your take on that?
Well, my take on it is that she got caught using, although it may not matter, but that she got caught using a technique that we see all the time on social media, where people will say, the political figure that I hate has said something outrageous, and then provide a link that goes to a story that may be about that political leader, but that doesn't indicate that that person actually said anything outrageous at all, or that puts it in the proper context, so that the bit that they've quoted is actually explained or makes more sense. So I don't think that's an unusual technique on social media. What I think is different here is that those two letters were posted on the government's website, where any of us who had done the work, and mea culpa here, I didn't, but any of us who had done the work could have gone and checked and read them carefully, which a couple of reporters and also a well-known economist did, and realized that they had, and then raised it in this news conference, that they didn't say what the Premier was saying they said. And the Premier did what she always does, is she replied glibly and smoothly with a stream of word salad that sounds very convincing, and any 10-second gap you cut out of it sounds coherent and seems to make sense, but all put together makes no sense at all, or is contradictory. And in fact, the newspaper, the headlines, the website headlines, I should say, but the news organization headlines this morning about that news conference said that they described the Premier as contradicting herself repeatedly in those interviews, or that series of interviews with a bunch of rather feisty reporters, two of whom stood out to me for mention in dispatches for being particularly brave and particularly determined to get their questions in, particularly Emma Graney of the Globe and Mail. But regardless of that, sorry, you want to?
Well, you mentioned an economist, and that's Professor Andrew Leach from the University of Alberta, and he had some tweets yesterday pointing this out, and then it was followed up. I guess it was on Sunday, maybe. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Then the reporters followed up in the press conference, and I found it a little interesting that it was an academic who kind of raised this issue, pointed it out in a public sphere. In fact, we journalists kind of missed the boat the first time around. Well,
it doesn't surprise me. I mean, for one thing, journalists are lazy, and mea culpa. What's the great line about? They're lazy and cheap. There was a line I heard years ago about most journalists wouldn't pay a nickel to see Jesus Christ wrestle a bear, but not strictly relevant to this. But anyway, and you're pressed for time. You're pushing a deadline. People say journalism is the first draft of history, so it's easy to miss things. But anyway, the point now is that this has been properly read by somebody who's gone through it with some care and has noted that there's a contradiction between what the Premier is saying and what she says these letters say.
And I think it's important here that she's basically dragging in the regulator, the Alberta Utilities Commission, and the Alberta Systems Operator. These are important institutions, and to use them to prop up we'll call it a false narrative, or a misstatement or an attempt to manipulate the narrative here. I think that says a lot about how the UCP approaches these kinds of energy issues.
I think that's fair, but I also think the UCP certainly falls right into the definition of a captured government, captured by the petroleum industry. And those institutions of that captured government are clearly captured as well. So I think that probably the disagreement, if there is one, between the Utilities Commission, for example, and the government is over the strategy of how the information was introduced, not over what they're trying to achieve, which is to, for one reason or another, to stall off these renewable energy projects. I mean, we can be deeply cynical about a government like the UCP government, but it's hard not to be when they seem to lie with such facility and such frequency, right?
Now, Dave, you and I have had this conversation before. Journalists don't accuse politicians of lying blithely because we don't know what their intent is. They may misstate. They put a spin on something that we don't agree with. So we very rarely say lie when it comes to them, but you just did. Why is that?
Well, I mean, because I can. I have the freedom to do so because I'm not really a journalist anymore. What's a journalist, right? I worked as a journalist for the Globe and Mail and for the Calgary Herald and for other publications and organizations for many years, but I don't now. I work as a blogger in which I do almost entirely commentary and express my own view. I happen to have a lot of readers because it's a view that has a lot of people agree with, but they don't see in mainstream media. That would be my interpretation of it. Also, I think I write in an entertaining way, but apparently WordPress doesn't agree because it always tells me that you need to rewrite this to make it clearer. But anyway, so I because I'm writing commentary and because it's so egregious and so obvious, I can say, well, they're lying or they're not being truthful. Although even I hesitate because of my history to do that. But someone who's writing for the Globe and Mail or writing for the Toronto Star, they can't step in and do that because the traditions of the profession, such as it is a profession, prevent them from doing so, and the habits of journalism prevent them from doing so. It's all very polite and gentlemanly, and care is taken. It's a bit like a debate in the legislature. You can't call someone a liar without having to withdraw it. So people are very cautious about that. They're also cautious about defamation issues, but in the case of political lies, I think we all understand that. Go ahead.
I think you're safe. I don't think the premier is going to come.
Well, I think I'm safe too.
Yeah, but now I want to take this discussion in a different direction because when the announcement was made and the government released the two letters, one from the AUC and one from the AESO, I in fact read those letters and I noticed it was odd that they both came out on the same day and it looked like a bit of a put-up job. And frankly, I didn't care. Because to me, I understand why Emma Graney and Catherine Gukowski pursued this with some vigor. Catching the government in a lie or a misrepresentation is an important thing. I mean, that's what reporters should do. But to me, the bigger issue here was that the Alberta government, the UCP, is completely wedded to the energy status quo, whether that's the oil and gas industry, whether that's the electricity system. They don't want to depart from it any more than they have to, any quicker than they have to. And that's going to be the subject of a column I'm currently writing and to be publishing later today. So all of this bickering about, well, when was that letter released? At what time on July 21st? And all of that, to me, is a bit of a distraction from the broader issue of the fact that this is a government that is committed to natural gas power generation and the old hub and spoke model, the old 125-year-old electricity, the power system model, at a time when the technology in the industry, power generation, transmission, distribution, storage, all of that is absolutely being transformed. And that to me is the story. So just your your take on that?
Well, strategically, I agree with you. Tactically, I disagree with you. And what I mean by that is, from a journalist's perspective, that I think every journalist covering this story recognizes that that is the real story. But it's hard to report on, and you get into a game with the government where it simply becomes a he said, she said game. Where the government repeats the same talking points over and over again, as Ms. Smith did yesterday, ad nauseum, repeating, it's just 6 months. What does it matter? It's just 6 months. It's just 6 months, even though it's 7 months. But that's just a detail. It was planned to be 6 months, right? So strategically, the bigger story needs to be covered, but also they have to feed the goat and provide a story every day. And this is an opportunity to get in there with some to ask some questions about the last thing that she said, that they have a bit of a wedge to create the to establish the argument that the government's not really being truthful here. So I understand why they did it. And I'm inclined to commentate on it because I try to commentate on something literally every day. So, usually to do with this story right now. So I think that it's important to push that discussion forward too. But you're right. I mean, the big story. This government's going to say they insist repeatedly that, oh, no, we're ready to go to net zero by 2050. It's just that 2035 is too soon. The reality of that is, I think everybody understands, including them, there's not actually much pretense about this, is that that's just a stalling tactic. They're hoping that Pierre Poilievre will become the prime minister and the federal conservatives will become the government, and that they'll pull all this stuff, that they'll simply withdraw from climate awareness programs and clean electricity programs. And then they can go back to what they were doing until the oil industry collapses. You and I both understand that the market is changing, even though petroleum use is going up right now. That there's a good chance that Alberta will be left in a much worse position for not planning. But this is the line that this government wants to pursue. You said it a moment ago, I forget your phrase, but just that it's the same old model, nothing changes. Well, they are determined to stick with this. Now, what prompted this particular 6 month freeze? I mean, there's rumors out there that no, it has nothing to do with their hatred of renewables, which is real enough and has been documented, but that rather it had to do with somebody who had a view that was going to be altered by the presence of wind turbines and didn't like it and had a connection to the government and phoned up, and then this happened. I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you can't do a search for.
I would argue, in fact, that the two stated reasons, asset reclamation, when solar panels and wind turbines come to the end of their 25 or 30-year life, combined with concerns over the use of prime, their words, agricultural land to put solar panels on, primarily, maybe taking it out of production in rural Alberta, probably, are legitimate concerns. The issue, of course, is you don't need to have a 7-month moratorium, and you don't really need the government to wade in with new policy in order to resolve those. The Alberta Utilities Commission has all the regulatory tools that it needs to address those particular issues. But so what I suspect here is that the government took what are important but not process or policy determining issues, and use that as pretext to slow everything down. And basically, it wasn't just her rural base that she was pandering to, but there are behind the scenes, because I've interviewed some of the executives involved, there are concerns about, Alberta is different. Alberta exceptionalism rears its head. We have 30-40 below winters. This is difficult. That makes it, we have periods during which wind and solar don't generate much power. So what do we do about that? I mean, the utilities are genuinely concerned. And as I will be arguing in the column, there's the issue of the distributed energy, wind and solar, being adopted by big commercial and industrial players and opting out of the grid. Then the costs having to be shared with a smaller and smaller group of customers. That's the subject of an AUC 2021 report, and there's a big concern in the industry about it. So I think my personal theory here is that the reclamation and land use is a pretext, to put a pause on everything and assuage the concerns of the utilities and other stakeholders who behind the scenes, I think, are lobbying for some sort of slowdown on wind and solar. That's my theory. What do you think of that?
Well, Markham, I think that's a completely credible theory. And I'm really not in a position to debunk it or attack it, but I just want to raise another point, and that is that one of the things that was irresistible about this story to journalists is the obvious contradiction between the way the government behaves with oil and gas and talks about behaving with nuclear and other forms of energy production and is behaving with renewables. There's an absolute difference, and so this, I think, there is an ideological factor here, this ideological belief or ideological advocacy on the right that essentially renewable energy production is a fraud. Now, we know that's not true now. We're seeing a story in the New York Times earlier or last week that indicated that actually renewables are coming on quicker in the United States, going gangbusters and coming on quicker than anyone predicted even just a couple of years ago. So they definitely, which seems likely they're on the wrong side of history about this, but I believe that belief is deeply held, and it's deeply held for political reasons because it appeals to their base. It's hard to sort out, what they really believe and why they're acting the way they do. And particularly since this is a secretive government that deprives us of information about what they're basing their decisions on, and maybe very centralized. I mean, it seems quite possible that the energy ministry and the environment ministry knew nothing about this. And that it was only handled through the so-called utilities ministry that's been set up with Neudorf as the minister. So, what you're saying is very credible. I expect all of these things are streams in it. I wanted to say something else just about Ms. Smith's own talking style. It's hard to determine whether she's really lying or whether she's just saying stuff that comes out of her mouth and then worrying about what it means later. Had it said that she often gets in trouble because she just says the first thing that comes into her head, and then she's always been able to correct it afterwards or go back on the story or slightly change it. So I guess that's I don't know if the correct term is pathological lying, but that's the kind of instinctive dishonesty thing that some people do. Or are they doing what Steve Bannon advocated, and pardon my language, but he said, what you need to do is flood the zone with shit. And nobody believes anything. And as long as you're saying something on social media, you're winning.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, that's her style. It wasn't her style. I remember, you'll recall back in the 2012 election campaign when she was Wild Rose leader. We had a reporter on that campaign. I covered it, and I'm sure you paid very close attention to it at the time. And she was far more articulate and argued more reasonably, whereas now, after all of those years that she spent being a radio host in Calgary on QR77, and then of course the Bannon influence on the American public discourse, she seems to have changed, and she very much has that kind of a style.
She's certainly more open about believing stuff that the majority of us, I think, at least in the commentary, so-called, think is crazy stuff, right? Her views about COVID-19, for example, they're pretty far out there. But so she's not as shy as she was. She's discovered it works for her to talk about that stuff and be open about it. But this government, and this goes back to Kenny and to conservatives before, and to some degree to any government, including the NDP, that it's easy to say one thing to one audience and another thing to another audience, and then just shrug it off between those discussions. I mean, people did that in the 1950s when there was no internet, right, in the 1960s. So that's why politicians have a reputation for being liars, right? Because sometimes they do.
Yes, they do. But one of the things that I would recommend is the presser from yesterday is up on the Alberta government's YouTube channel, and you really should take a listen to it. Particularly, I would argue right from the very beginning, because she spends some time in the early part of the presser explaining how she thinks about renewables and about various other technologies and timelines and all of that. And for all of her obfuscation and the kind of talking style that she has now, there's a lot of really good information in there. And in fact, with her press conferences, I actually prefer to have them transcribed so that I can read them, and then I'm not swayed by her speaking style, and I can get down to the nuts and bolts of it. And when I do that, I actually find there's a lot of insight into her thinking about energy and about this particular issue.
I mean, I'm a big believer in transcripts too, and actually letting people say what they say. What's striking with transcripts of what Danielle Smith says is that the integral contradictions are much more apparent when you're reading it, and you can look back a couple of lines, than when you're listening to it and there's this flow of word salad flowing over you that all at any given moment appears to make sense. So I agree. What I would say, the way the press conference went, and this sometimes happens with press conferences, is that it got off the track the government tried to get it on. She started with a little Jeremiah about all the things that make her mad about the federal government and all of this Alberta Sovereignty Association nonsense. And this was a very structured little speech that was directed at kind of setting this is our relationship with the federal government. This, of course, will all change if the government changes. Then exactly the same policies will be completely acceptable if it's a conservative delivery. But then she moves from that to questions, and the first two questions they ask are the Western Standard and the Rebel News, and so two far-right online publications that are sympathetic to the government, and I thought the questions asked by their two reporters were pretty pathetic, and they were clearly designed to pump her tires, and to sow doubt about the independence of the Supreme Court of Canada, which I think is a dangerous thing that journalists, so-called journalists, ought not to be doing. But then the floor was open to journalist question, and the media, the professional media in Alberta, actually I think did a very good job on that, and they went, and several reporters went after her on the real issue of the day, which was this thing about the letters and that was they knew the interview was going to go that way, but it didn't go the way they necessarily wanted it to.
Well, let's wrap up this interview with this conversation with a couple of comments about Rebel Media and the Western Standard and this government, as well as the CPC, I might add, federally, their reliance upon these alt-right, news media organizations that really, they don't adhere to the Canadian Association of Journalists ethics guidelines. They don't practice journalism and reporting the way that you and I were taught those many decades ago. And I take after them on a regular basis on social media because the stories, if you can call them that they publish are just absolutely outrageous and full of falsehoods and all sorts of things. And yet this government treats them not only as if they were legitimate journalists, but in fact gives them favored status. To me, that is outrageous and something that too often doesn't get mentioned.
Well, it's very troubling, and your analysis is quite right on every point. But what's happening. It's the trend in the United States. It's a trend now in Western Europe. It's a trend in Australia. So it's not a surprise that we're seeing this here. I mean, I don't know what you can do about it, except repeat the fact that they're not practicing legitimate journalism, but they are propaganda organizations, and who funds them? Who funds these organizations? That would be a good journalistic question to go after. It's quite hard to find out. It's not necessarily just donations from suckers, although that's part of it. I mean, people give me a hard time all the time. They say, they'll write in my comments section, well, you're not being fair. You didn't give the other side of the story, or you didn't cover this story. Well, I say, well, I'm a blogger. This is my hobby. It's not my profession. I write only stories that interest me, and I take a point of view all the time. So to some degree, they're doing the same thing, but they're passing themselves off as legitimate news organizations.
Okay, but there's a difference here, and I think this is really important to point out, because there is not an equivalency between David Climenhaga and Rebel Media and Western Standard, because while you are a blogger and while you are a commentator and not a reporter, you still adhere to the basic journalism principles.
And old habits die hard.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's That's why I'm having you on here, is because you do that, and you have, therefore, your views have a legitimacy that Ezra Levance or Derek Fildebrands don't. Like, I would never have them on a podcast or do one of these kinds of interviews, because they fundamentally don't adhere to facts or to the truth.
Well, I'll tell
Whereas
you,
you do, even though you have a point of
I
view.
try to, and when I make a mistake, I correct it. Case in point was the blog that I posted. This was unusual, but the day before yesterday, the one I wrote the day before yesterday, there was a mistake in it. There was an omission, and it was not simple to correct. It wasn't just something I could go in and correct the spelling of a name or something. So I pulled it, and I've corrected it. And on my lunch hour today, I'll repost it with the new information and with the correction at the bottom. So yeah, I do. It really bugs me if my blogs are not accurately factual, and it upsets me, right? But I don't. I think that some of the publications you mentioned go into this intentionally telling lies, knowing that they're lies because they advance their political position. But this is the zeitgeist, if that's how you pronounce it, the zeitgeist, however you pronounce that word. This is the spirit of the age, right? And I don't know what we do about it.
Well, I think we do some of what we're doing today, which is call it out, and so that viewers and readers have a better understanding of it. But Dave, always a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you very much for this.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on, and we'll see you again.